A theme from the 1970s that had made a comeback is the social decay. It is a theme which the first and the worst Mad Max movie is based on, and we also recognize it from other vigilante films from that period, where names like Dirty Harry and Death Wish should be familiar. Instead of depicting the world after the disaster, what is depicted instead is the ongoing decay. We see it in the French suburb movies, North and South American prison series, movies of the Civil War on the Balkans and in Africa, etc. We can also notice this trend in more mature cyberpunk and science fiction, as in, for example, Stephen Neal's The Diamond Age and Dante's Babylon Babies. There is, as usual, a very real background to why the theme has crept into the zeitgeist. Our societies are characterized by decay, by the disintegration of the social capital in the form of civil courage, respect, and shared norms crumble, and even though it hasn't obviously gone as far in either Malmo, Rinkeby, Amsterdam, Paris, or London as in Rwanda and Sao Paulo, one can imagine the parallels. The public space is brutalized and insecure and unstoppable compared to what it was only a few decades ago. Parts of European cities are no-go areas for indigenous Europeans, and the collective or individual violence again plays a role in our communities, which it hasn't done for a long time. The difference between South Africa and Stockholm is now a question of degree, not distinctively different. When a North American city like New Orleans gets overflooded, for example, large parts of the police force flee in their cars while looters are attacking both the police and hospitals. Or how about when Rosengård each week for a period of 4 months had been lit on fire, and when the ambulance and the fire department arrived they got attacked by Muslim and African gangs with bricks. That something has happened, that something has changed, has become clear. The ethnic aspect and world capitalism. All of this has an ethnic aspect, even though in the public discourse it is spoken very little about and quietly about this. It can therefore, to the one who shapes their worldview based on what they see on TV, seem like a mere coincidence that the societies brutalizing occur at the same time as we are experiencing mass immigration. At the same time, one cannot explain it solely by ethnic factors. Society's decay would be in fact, even though immigration would have been minimal. One can here mention factors like increased visibility of inequality in many societies, the consumer society, and an increasing individualization and isolation. However, isolation is a product of diversity. See Robert Putnam's Downside of Diversity, Sociology Report. And the more isolated we have become, the more in need of materialism we'll be, and the more dependent on a consumer society we'll get. Ultimately, these factors can be traced to global capitalism. In fact, global capitalism is the biggest contributor to diversity and multiculturalism. Capitalism is the biggest contributor to the cultural left's popularity among youths. The ethnic aspect's relevancy to the system's inability gets highlighted by both a Marxist theorist as Immanuel Wallerstein and the identitist ideologist Guillaume Fay. With growing ethnic minorities in Europe, such phenomena as economic crisis will have a significantly more bloody consequence than they would have gotten otherwise. Post-apocalyptic themes. An interesting thought experiment could be to compare the post-apocalyptic genre themes with the ongoing development, not least since this offers a fresh dose of creative thinking and a little wider perspective. The scenes with the marauding road warriors from Mad Max or the Terminator series murderous robots we can in this context probably leave aside, but some of the themes from a society in decay which the genre describes we can trace today. Neo-tribalism.
My life fades, the vision dims, all that remains are memories. I remember a time of chaos, ruined dreams, this wasted land. But most of all, I remember the road warrior, the man we called Max. To understand who he was, you have to go back to another time, when the world was powered by the black fuel, and the desert sprouted great cities of pipe and steel. Gone now, swept away. For reasons long forgotten, two mighty warrior tribes went to war and touched off a blaze which engulfed them all. Without fuel, they were nothing. They'd built a house of straw. The thundering machine sputtered and stopped. Their leaders talked and talked and talked. But nothing could stem the avalanche. Their world crumbled. The cities exploded. A whirlwind of looting. A firestorm of fear. Men began to feed on men.
Mad Max 2: The Road Warrior. In a society that no longer permeates with a sense of strong solidarity and common values, and that is no longer dominated by a comprehensive system of power, the pure violence will gradually come to play an increasing role. We can already see this in some Swedish schools where violence has become a natural part of everyday life. Contrary to what one or another social Darwinist might think, this violence of power is in 9 cases out of 10, however, not individual, but rather collective, for example in the form of possessing numerous cousins as a means of gaining respect and power. It will therefore be better to join together with others in strong communities. And this is the way people will run a more violent society. In multi-ethnic communities, these communities will, in most cases, be either ethnic, religious, or in similar way based on strong identities, excluding inherited similarities for the sake of self-sameness and one's own identity and reflections of it. This is of course a difference from the post-apocalyptic genre's homogeneous situation. We can compare our time to the 1980s, but it is hinted in several ways of our time's depictions of the social decay's more extreme forms. Ethnic prison gangs in the Prison series and ethnic groups in Civil War. This particular aspect one can hardly expect any more attention from by the popular culture works, since it is not politically correct. Guillaume Fay is here talking about archaeological futurism, by which he means that in the new situation, individualism is no longer rational, and the people of Europe are therefore obliged to return to more archaic virtues. Those groups who create a strong internal solidarity will dominate, while those who fail or do not even try are going to live their days as slaves, de facto or de jure. Religion's Renaissance. In the Mad Max movies, religion plays a very limited role, even though in the final movie there appear a tribe of children with a strange cargo cult. In The Old Mutant, the majority were also atheists, and alleging that people in the future of Scandinavia are seldom religious. They are too caught up in surviving. In reality, however, it is the opposite. It is in decadent times of security and prosperity as atheism grows, whilst it is crisis and conflicts which cause people to seek something higher and eternal. It was not uncommon for fighters who survived decades of killing in Europe and in the Middle East to find sense in the Crusades and in jihad. It gave them morale and drove them to be confident and courageous in battle, which demoralized the enemy. The alternative would be a brutalization and degeneration of the own person, which history also gives many examples of. But it is not those examples which come to dominate, and they thus doesn't seem to be group evolutionary effective. This religion's return can also be sensed in popular cultural depictions of our time and close dark future, as in the more mature cyberpunk with representatives like Dantec and Stevenson, We also see it in Islam's growth here in Europe and around the globe. Disastrous convergence. We can already see several challenges and crises that are growing more serious in the triumphant system's bosom. Jürgen Habermas spoke already several decades ago on the legitimacy crisis. Faes and Wallerstein points to the ethnic factor, and to this the financial crisis that is growing gets added, and the combination is a scary formula. Faye is here talking about disaster convergence, and by this he means that the system can probably handle a crisis. They handled, after all, both the crisis in the 1930s and 1970s, stagflation and oil crisis, but when several crises simultaneously emerge, they are reinforcing each other. For example, most Northern European countries can, after all, deal with both mass unemployment and cuts, but when there is added an ethnic factor, this increases the risk that this also leads to race riots and religious fundamentalism in their own suburbs. One can therefore say that our left liberal upper class have built in a time bomb in the very society they administer, by frenetically working for a maximum mass immigration. What this leads to in the long run, the future will tell.